Number 8. Grzegorz Kozic. 22-year-old Grzegorz Kozic and Karolina Ciwilik, aged 20, had been dating for a few years before the latter ended the relationship in April of 2017 as she'd become wary of Kozic's excessive drinking and the aggressive behavior that ensued from it. The former couple, both of Polish descent and living in London, continued seeing each other as friends. Nevertheless, Kozic pleaded with his ex, an architecture student at the University of Westminster and part-time waitress at the Polish embassy, to take him back. He reportedly followed her around London and sent her repeated messages on social media. After a few weeks, Ciwilik started dating a mutual friend. Kozic's jealousy and anger spiraled out of control when he was rejected, as he asked his ex to choose between him and her new love interest. On May the 4th, he went to see her at his cousin's 2-bedroom flat in Mile End, East London. It was there that, armed with a kitchen knife, Kozic unleashed a frenzied attack. He slashed and stabbed the young woman at least 20 times in the neck, head and body. Dawid Ciwilik and Monika Fijak, aged 24 and 42 respectively, were also at the address and heard the victim screaming from the bathroom. They found Kozic standing over her and were also stabbed while attempting to wrestle the knife away from him. They both recovered after receiving treatment at a local hospital, but Ciwilik, who'd never even had a chance to defend herself in the savage attack, died from her injuries. Kozic, who maintained that he'd loved the victim and had only gone to the apartment with the intention of talking to her, was jailed for life, with a minimum of 20 years served. Number 7. Jonathan McSherry. In March of 2019, Irish woman Jessica Bowes was awarded over $165,000 after suing her ex-boyfriend over a gruesome attack that had occurred as she was returning to her home from a night out in Clondalkin, Dublin. In 2014, she'd sought a protective order against her ex-soldier Jonathan McSherry after a prolonged psychologically and physically abusive relationship. On December the 20th of 2015, as Bowes returned home, McSherry, then in his early 30s, was waiting to ambush her at the address. As shown by CCTV footage, he dragged the mother of his 2 children from the taxi before headbutting and punching her repeatedly. He then kicked her up to 20 times as she sought refuge under a parked car. The attack lasted close to 2 minutes, over the course of which Bowes lost consciousness twice, before eventually crawling to safety into a neighbor's house. McSherry had broken nearly every bone in her face, and surgeons subsequently had to insert a permanent metal plate through Bowes' mouth in order to realign her facial bones. She underwent a psychological evaluation that concluded her mental health had been severely affected by her ex's onslaught. She had symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic anxiety, nightmares, and had become fearful of her own safety and that of her children. Prior to being ordered to pay damages, McSherry had served 22 months of a 3.5-year prison sentence for the assault. Number 6. Robert Jenny. Robert Jenny and Louise Reed from Middlesbrough, England, had met when they were in their teens and began dating years later in the spring of 2018 after a chance encounter at a soccer match. The relationship had been promising in the beginning, but within 3 months, 27-year-old Reed reported that Jenny had become controlling and aggressive. On the night of July the 21st, they got into an argument at his parents' house that ended in 30-year-old Jenny punching Reed and dragging her down 3 flights of stairs. In spite of the attack, the woman decided to give him a second chance and help Jenny deal with his demons by encouraging him to get professional treatment for his anger and talk openly about his emotions. Over 2 weeks later, on August the 8th, during another escalating argument, Jenny attacked the mother of one even more viciously than before. He threw Reed around the house before punching and headbutting her into unconsciousness. When the woman came to, she was forced to flee the home through the kitchen window. Ultimately, at Teesside Magistrates Court, Jenny was handed a 12-month community order for the assault and instructed to pay the victim the equivalent of $100 in compensation. Reed later shared a graphic photo on Facebook of the attack's aftermath, showing her with blood streaming down her face in an effort to encourage other victims of domestic violence to speak out. She wrote about the unforgettable look of hate and anger on her ex's face during the beatdown and cautioned other women towards recognizing the early signs of an abusive relationship such as obsessive and controlling behavior. Reed also criticized the light sentence that Jenny had received, calling it disgusting, highlighting that she'd been left emotionally traumatized by an attack that could have ended her life, while Jenny was free and thus able to potentially victimize other women. Number 5. Zachary Gross. In March of 2017, Kentucky man Zachary Gross, aged 31, was sentenced to 21 years in prison at Boone County Circuit Court for a horrific attack he'd perpetrated against his ex-girlfriend, Marilyn Stanley. The incident had occurred in September of 2015 when, as argued by prosecutors, Gross had become enraged that another man had posted a photo of Stanley and her son on Facebook. During a meal, he started striking her in the face before using a knife to remove most of her scalp. He then ordered his pit bull, named Capone, to attack the woman. Capone tore Stanley's ear off, with Gross then praising the dog for the gruesome mauling. Prosecutors also stated that after the victim had been scalped and mutilated, Gross forced her up in front of a mirror so that she would see the damage he'd inflicted upon her. He reportedly told the woman, "You're bald now. Who's going to want you now?" He subsequently placed her severed scalp in a plastic bag and dropped her off in her mother's neighborhood, after which the authorities were alerted. The mother of one was rushed to a hospital and throughout her ordeal had 6 surgeries and was left with permanent nerve damage. She couldn't remember the scalping due to a combination of shock and blood loss. During his sentencing, Gross told a judge, "I don't need a lecture," after claiming that he didn't feel responsible and maintaining his innocence. Number 4. Daniel Murtaugh. Irishman Daniel Murtaugh savagely beat his ex-girlfriend, 30-year-old beautician Nadine Lott, at the latter's home in St. Mary's Court, Arklow, on December the 14th of 2019. He then fled the scene in his Volvo and later in the morning crashed into a ditch, sustaining minor injuries. He told a motorist who'd stopped to help him, "I killed my wife because she was with my friend." Lott's mother found her struggling to breathe while lying on her back in the kitchen. She'd been beaten so badly that her face was left unrecognizable. A neighbor and eyewitness reported to have heard Murtaugh, then in his early 30s, growling as he assaulted his ex, comparing the attack to that of a wild animal. It later emerged that Murtaugh, who'd been boxing for years, had held the charger of a tire pump in his hand for solidity and wrapped the tire around his knuckles before delivering relentless blows to his ex-girlfriend's face and body. A paramedic recalled kneeling on broken glass to revive the woman and claimed that he'd forever be haunted by the scene, which he described as one of the most horrendous he'd ever walked into. Lott was rushed to a Dublin hospital where she passed away 3 days after the attack, with the cause of death determined to have been hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy due to traumatic head, neck and chest injuries. Murtaugh was charged with murder, but his defense pushed for a downgrade to manslaughter, claiming that he wasn't responsible for his actions because he'd been under the influence of drugs and alcohol. The prosecution put forward the notion that the sheer brutality of the beatdown, as well as the lack of an effort from Murtaugh to find help for the victim, proved murderous intent. The latter argument prevailed. A jury rejected Murtaugh's defense, and he was given a mandatory term of life imprisonment. Number 3. Douglas Bell. In July of 2019, while driving through South Shields in South Tyneside, England, 32-year-old Douglas Bell spotted his ex-girlfriend, Gemma Humphrey, pushing their young daughter in a pram down the street. 30-year-old Humphrey had broken up with Bell in December of 2017 after an abusive relationship lasting 3 years. The latter refused to accept her decision, which led to Humphrey taking out a restraining order against him. He was in direct violation of it in July of 2019 when he pulled up alongside her. The woman was so fearful of Bell that she ran away but then returned, realizing she'd left their daughter behind. When Humphrey came back, Bell punched her twice in the head, dropping her to the pavement, which caused her to bump her head and black out. She regained consciousness on his bathroom floor with blood on her face and in a state of panic. Looking back on the moments that followed, Humphrey remembered how unfazed Bell had been about what he'd done. He admitted to knocking her out and told the woman to clean her face of blood so that their daughter wouldn't see. Humphrey told her crazed ex that he'd broken her jaw, which he denied doing, before dropping her off and telling her to text him later. She called her mother, who alerted the police and then took her to the hospital. A photo of Humphrey taken right after the attack showed her with a severely swollen jaw and a black eye. She underwent a surgery of over 4 hours in which metal screws and plates were inserted in her face to mend her broken jaw, and was later told she'd never get the feeling back in her face. Bell was subsequently jailed for 2 years, a sentence that Humphrey deemed to have been far too lenient. Number 2. Katie LEONG. In January of 2015, Romanian man Daniel Rotariu, then in his late 20s, met Katie LEONG and they began a relationship, eventually moving in together to a house in Leicester, England. LEONG had told Rotariu that she was 36 years old, when in reality she was in her early 50s. The lie would foreshadow a troubled relationship marred by arguments in which the two eventually began to drift apart. In July of 2016, Rotariu was sleeping alone in the bed after yet another row with LEONG. He woke up in agony and initially believed that the woman had poured boiling water over him. Rotariu recounted that the pain was so intense that he believed himself to still be dreaming. He rose from the bed and then could taste in his mouth that it wasn't water with which LEONG had doused him. She'd poured on him half a liter of highly concentrated sulfuric acid that had begun burning away the flesh on his body and face, rendering him unable to see. A court would later hear that LEONG had previously tested the acid on sausage meat to make sure it would dissolve human flesh. She was ultimately found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 17 years served. In the attack's immediate aftermath, Rotariu was rushed to Nottingham City Hospital, where he spent 5 weeks in a coma. The attack had blinded him while also inflicting such severe disfiguration that his own family couldn't recognize him. In the early days of his recovery, Rotariu was so depressed that he'd considered taking his own life. He then found strength and support in his caregiver, Anna Katanga, who helped him through rehab at a support center. Before long, they developed feelings for each other and Katanga quit her job so that they could start dating. A media report from July of 2019, 3 years after Rotariu had been horrifically attacked by his crazed ex, detailed how his relationship with Katanga had blossomed. The pair had gotten married in the man's hometown of Timisoara and had a 10-month-old son, David. Rotariu told a media outlet, "I've had the happy ending I never thought was possible." Number 1. Bradley Thomas Woss. On February the 13th of 2018, the authorities in California found the lifeless body of 31-year-old Casey McKinney at her Redlands apartment. Further investigation revealed that the woman had been at home with her boyfriend and son when her ex, Bradley Thomas Woss, burst in and opened fire on them. After shooting McKinney in the face, Woss turned his attention on the child, identified as his own son and the new boyfriend, who wasn't named by the authorities. The latter managed to escape the apartment by grabbing the woman's son and jumping from a second-floor balcony. He was hurt in the fall, but eventually recovered while the child was unharmed and later placed in the custody of protective services. McKinney succumbed to her injuries at the scene, and the police subsequently launched efforts to track down Woss. More than a week since the shooting, his body was found at the Indian Hills Golf Club in Mira Loma. It was determined that he died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and while his motive for McKinney's murder remained unclear, the de facto speculation was that he'd been angry at the woman for getting in a new relationship. Thanks for watching. Would you rather be stalked by your ex or change your residence every month for a year? Let us know in the comments section below.